You know, it's pretty wild to think about, but over 80% of, well, everything you own, use, and eat probably got to you on a massive ship. They're like the invisible engines of our entire global economy. But here's the thing. These steel giants, they don't last forever. After about 25, maybe 30 years, they just get old, rusty, way too expensive to keep running. So what happens when a ship finally reaches the end of the line?
Yeah, it's a question most of us probably never even think to ask, right? But the answer? Well, the answer takes us to a hidden, really dangerous, and honestly, an incredibly important part of our interconnected world.
On paper, the solution sounds, well, pretty much perfect. Ship recycling. I mean, instead of just sinking these massive things or letting them rust away somewhere, the whole idea is that we can take them apart and reuse almost everything. It's seen as the most logical and definitely the most environmentally friendly option.
And here's one of the biggest selling points. Making new steel from scratch is just incredibly energy intensive. But using recycled steel from an old ship, get this, that only takes about 1/3 of the energy. I mean, that's a massive saving. It really seems like a total win-win for everyone involved. But is it really?
Okay, so that clean, efficient picture we just painted, we need to talk about the reality on the ground, because it's a lot more complex and way, way more dangerous.
This is a Langsosia on the coast of India. It is, quite literally, the largest ship graveyard on the entire planet. And here, ships aren't carefully taken apart in some clean, modern dry dock. No, they're run aground at full speed, just crashed right onto the beach, to be torn apart, piece by piece, by hand. So who's doing this absolutely backbreaking work? We're talking about tens of thousands of migrant laborers, working in conditions that, honestly, some have compared to modern-day slavery. They can work up to 14 hours a day for wages that are just shockingly low, often less than $3 a day.
And you know, what's really powerful here is who's making this statement. This isn't just some activist group. This is the International Labor Organization, a UN agency. They have officially called shipbreaking one of the most dangerous occupations in the entire world. That's a huge deal. And here's exactly why. You've got workers exposed to this toxic cocktail of hazards every single day. There's asbestos from old insulation just floating in the air. They're cutting through paint that's laced with heavy metals like lead and mercury. Trapped gases in the old fuel tanks, they can explode without any warning. And just one wrong move, one misstep, could send a multi-ton plate of steel crashing down. It is, no exaggeration, a daily battle for survival.
So, the big question is, why? Why does this incredibly dangerous industry end up concentrated in just a few places on the entire planet? Well, the answer, as it so often does, really just comes down to economics.
So if you look at the numbers, the vast majority of the world's shipbreaking happens in just a handful of countries. You see India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan just dominating the industry. And this is no accident. This is the result of a very deliberate global shift.
You know, this whole thing didn't happen overnight. Shipbreaking didn't start in South Asia. Far from it. Go back to the mid-20th century, and this work was being done in the US and the UK. But then, as worker safety laws and environmental regulations got stricter, and of course, as labor costs went up, the industry basically packed its bags. It chased the path of least resistance, first to Southern Europe, then to East Asia, and finally, it landed right where we see it today, where regulations are the loosest and labor is the cheapest.
There's actually a name for this whole process. It's called cost shifting, and it's based on this really controversial memo from a former World Bank chief economist. The argument was basically that it makes perfect economic sense to dump toxic waste in the lowest wage countries. And why? Well, because the cost of someone getting sick or even dying is measured in their lost earnings, which are of course lower in poorer nations. It's an absolutely brutal logic that literally puts a price tag on a human life.
So how do ship owners actually do this, legally? Well, they use something called flags of convenience. Basically, instead of registering their ship in their home country, let's say Germany or Japan, they register it in a country with much looser rules, like Panama or Liberia. It's a kind of legal loophole. And when it's time to scrap the ship, this little trick makes it way easier to get around their home country's strict environmental laws and just dump the problem somewhere else.
All right, so for decades, this whole system just kind of operated in this legal gray area. But eventually, the human and environmental cost just became too big to ignore. And that's what sparked this big push for international rules to finally try and clean up the industry.
The first major attempt was something called the Basel Convention. It tried to regulate all toxic waste. But as we just saw, ship owners found it pretty easy to get around using those flags of convenience. So a much more targeted solution was needed. And that's where the Hong Kong Convention comes in. It was designed specifically for ships, with the goal of creating a cradle-to-grave system of responsibility.
So, what does this convention actually require? Okay, it's basically three big things. First, every single ship has to keep an inventory of all its hazardous materials. Think of it like a passport for all the toxic stuff on board. Second, the recycling yards themselves have to be officially authorized, proving they can actually handle these materials safely. And third, before any work even begins, every single ship needs its own specific ship recycling plan, detailing exactly how it will be taken apart safely.
And this is the really crucial part. After just sitting there for over 15 years, waiting for enough countries to finally sign on, the Hong Kong Convention is finally becoming international law. It officially goes into force on June 26, 2025. This could be a massive turning point for the entire industry.
But even with these new global rules finally on the books, the problem isn't, well, it's not completely solved. There's this fundamental tension right at the heart of this industry, and it's something that rules on paper can't easily fix on their own.
Okay, so on one hand, you have the benefits, and they are huge for these countries. This industry provides millions of tons of cheap steel. I mean, in Bangladesh, recycled ship steel meets 20% of the entire country's demand. It also creates tens of thousands of jobs where there really aren't many other options. But then you have the other side of the coin. The burdens are just immense. Totally devastated coastlines, high rates of worker injury and death, and entire communities exposed to toxic materials for generations to come.
So yeah, while the Hong Kong Convention is absolutely a monumental step forward, the future is, well, it's still pretty uncertain. Actually enforcing these rules on the ground in those yards is going to be a massive challenge. And let's be honest, as long as there is big money to be saved by cutting corners on safety and the environment, the incentive to cheat the system is going to remain incredibly powerful.
Which really leaves us with this one big final question. In our totally globalized world, who is ultimately responsible for a ship's final toxic voyage? Is it the ship owner who's just looking for the best price? Is it the yard owner who's competing for the business? The governments that turn a blind eye? Or is it maybe all of us who benefit every single day from the cheap global shipping these vessels provide? It's a tough question, and there's definitely no easy answer.